Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Dr. Kennedy Graham.
My question is to the Minister for Climate Change Issues International Negotiations. Will New Zealand support a legally binding agreement to cut global greenhouse gas emissions at the Cancun Climate Change Conference this December? If not, why not?
The Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister for International Climate Change Negotiations, yes, this is this government's ambition. This was the position at Bali, at Copenhagen, and will also be so at Cancun. However, all indications are that this is unlikely to be achieved at Cancun, but New Zealand is ready and willing to make as much progress as is possible.
Supplementary.
Dr. Kennedy Graham.
If such an agreement is not likely, and we are then obliged to rely on the Copenhagen Accord instead, does he believe that the combined voluntary emission cuts promised under the Copenhagen Accord will be sufficient to meet the agreed safe threshold of 2 degrees Celsius, which requires a 28% reduction in global emissions by 2020?
Mr. Speaker, the climate change negotiations are very much the art of the possible, because getting the agreement of over 190 countries on such a complex issue, it is the government's view that the Copenhagen Accord was a second best outcome from Copenhagen, but it is better than nothing. And our hope is that we're going to be able to translate some of the good work that's included in the Copenhagen Accord into a more robust international agreement.
Dr. Kennedy Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If in fact climate change negotiations are the art of the possible, is it possible for him to reconcile his plan to cut national emissions by 10 to 20% with a global reduction target of 28%, given that as a developed country we are obliged to take a larger share of the 28%, notwithstanding our special situation on agriculture?
Mr. Speaker, I think it's very important that the Parliament understand that the 10 to 20% reduction target range for New Zealand is of course based on 1990 emissions. And 1990 emissions grew between then and 2008 by 25%, a very substantial increase. The second point that's quite unique to New Zealand is that of course 50% of our emissions come from agriculture, where the technologies are a lot more challenging. So my view is that a 10 to 20% reduction from 1990 levels by 2020 is a hugely challenging target for New Zealand.
Louise Upston.
Supplementary question to the Minister for Climate Change Issues. What progress has New Zealand made in climate change, and will this enable New Zealand to meet its Kyoto obligations?
Mr. Speaker, we've made good progress with the emissions trading scheme coming into effect on the 1st of July, and I'm encouraged that the future forecast projections of emissions show the first years of decline in New Zealand's net emissions in any time since 1990. That is, during every year of the previous Labor administration, emissions went up. Well, actually, the member interjects. It's interesting to note that the big gains have been firstly in the area of forestry, because under his government New Zealand deforested, under our government we're planting trees, and the second big gains have actually been in the area of renewable energy, where rather than building thermal power stations, which occurred under the previous government, we've currently got a record level of investment in renewable energy, and that should be welcomed.
John Boscawen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Supplementary to the Minister of Climate Change Issues. Does he agree with the Greenhouse Policy Coalition that when comparing New Zealand's emissions trading scheme with the European Union ETS, from 2015 only 50% of emissions in the EU are covered, compared to 100% in New Zealand? If so, does he accept that New Zealand's emissions trading scheme is more comprehensive than the European ETS, and may also render us, quote, uncompetitive with Australia, as the Minister for the Environment has just explained to the House with reference to his props of Purcell and Surf?
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, firstly with the issue and the comparison with Australia, it's interesting to note that electricity prices in Australia over the last 5 years have gone up by more than 30% in response to a whole lot of regulatory measures that Australian governments, in my view, in an inefficient way, has tried to deal with the challenge of climate change. So I think we're well placed in competitive terms with Australia. In respect of the comparison with Europe, it's very important that you compare like with like. If you compare our ETS today with that of the European Union, ours covers less and is less aggressive. And we have a review of the ETS next year. The commitment of this government is to ensure that New Zealand does its fair share on climate change, not that we should try and be a world leader, because we have to carefully balance those economic and environmental responsibilities.
Question number 10, the Honourable Trevor Mallard.